Ethan Hayes had lived most of his life believing that the universe had already taken everything from him that truly mattered. Once, he had been a man whose laughter echoed across rolling fields, whose hands were always warm with purpose, and whose heart beat in harmony with another. But after the day he lost his wife, lost not just to fate but to a cruel silence that settled like dust over his world, he became a ghost in his own life. His ranch stretched across endless acres of wheat fields and fenced pastures, a place once filled with dreams of a bustling family, of tiny boots by the door, and children racing through the barn as the horses whinnied in amusement. Now every piece of that land whispered stories of a life that never came to be. Each sunrise cast golden light across the old wood of the porch where he once sat with his wife, her head resting against his shoulder as they spoke softly about the future they would build. Now he sat there alone, coffee cooling in his cup, silence pressing against his chest, memories heavier than any saddle he had ever lifted. His boots grew worn not just from work but from pacing the same steps of routine day after day, as if repetition could somehow anchor him to the world he felt himself silently slipping away from. The ranch hands offered polite nods, gentle greetings, and respectful distance. They knew pain when they saw it. Ranch life had a way of teaching men to recognize grief, to tip their hats and leave it be. Ethan would spend mornings tending the horses, brushing their coats with quiet patience, speaking to them in the only soft voice he still remembered how to use. Horses listened without asking questions, and that was a comfort he clung to. The barn, once a sanctuary filled with laughter and the occasional playful shout, echoed now only with the rhythm of hooves against hay and the lonely creak of wooden beams aging alongside. Some days the only sounds that filled the air were the clucks of hens, the rustle of cattle, and the hum of wind sliding across the tall grass. It was peaceful, but peace had grown dull without warmth to accompany. Every corner of his small farmhouse was preserved like a museum of love that had vanished. Her favorite mug still sat on the shelf untouched but always dusted, because leaving it dirty felt like forgetting her. Yet cleaning it too much felt like admitting she was gone. Her shawl still hung on the nail by the fireplace, where she last placed it on a chilly autumn night before fate carried her away. Even in the drawers, her neatly folded scarves and old letters waited like delicate relics that time dared not disturb. Ethan didn't have the courage to move them, but he didn't have the strength to throw them away either. The world said she was gone, lost to an accident in the river miles away. The search parties came and went, consoling words spilled like rain, and then life told him to move on. But Ethan never truly accepted it. Death felt clean in its finality. But her disappearance felt unfinished, like a book whose last chapter had been torn out. As the seasons rolled by, summers blazing across the fields, winters frosting every fence post, Ethan's grief settled into a quiet companion, neither friend nor enemy, just present. The townspeople spoke kindly when they saw him, tipping their hats with sympathy stitched into every gesture. Some whispered about how he still kept her memory alive. Others admired his loyalty, and a few with gentle pity believed he clung too tightly to a love long gone. Children in town would sometimes watch him ride into the market with his weathered hat and silver-streaked beard, wondering why the rancher always looked like he carried storms behind his eyes. But Ethan did not mind whispers or pity. His grief was the last thread that tied him to the woman he once called his whole world, and he guarded it fiercely, as if letting go would mean losing her all over again. Still, there were moments, brief flickers between chores or during quiet twilight hours, when he wondered whether fate had mistaken him for someone stronger. He would lean against the fence, staring out at the open land, and imagine her walking toward him again, hair flowing in the wind, smile warm as summer sunlight. Then reality would return, heavy and unforgiving, and he would pull his hat lower, pretending he was shielding his eyes from the fading light. Rather than wiping away tears he refused to shed in public. People said time healed all wounds, but Ethan found that time simply taught you how to carry them more quietly. His days were long, his nights were longer, and loneliness was an uninvited guest who never left. Yet he endured, not because he hoped for joy to return, but because he did not know any other way to live. The ranch was his anchor, his memory, his promise that once upon a time he had been loved deeply and had loved in return. And though the world thought his story had already ended, Ethan continued breathing, continued walking, unaware that destiny had been waiting, patient and silent, for the day something extraordinary would return to his life, and everything he thought he knew about lost love. And miracles would be rewritten forever. One chilly evening, As Ethan finished feeding the horses and brushing the dust off his worn flannel sleeves, he heard soft footsteps approaching from the dusty trail leading to the ranch gate. At first, he assumed it was a neighbor coming to ask for help with a broken fence or a lost calf. Something simple, something ordinary, because nothing extraordinary had happened in his life for years. But when the footsteps halted near his porch, and he heard the faint rustle of small shoes shifting hesitantly on gravel, a strange prickle crawled up his spine. It wasn't the heavy tread of grown boots, nor the confident stride of ranch hands or travelers. It was light, uncertain, and trembling like a pair of tiny hearts beating too fast. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans, feeling a sudden weight settle in his chest. The kind that comes before a storm or a memory. The evening air carried a whisper of winter, and the sun dipped behind the horizon, spilling long shadows across the ranch. He thought only he would walk for the rest of his days. When he finally reached the doorway and pulled it open, the breath caught in his throat before he could say a single word. Standing at the bottom of his porch steps were two identical little girls, no more than 6 years old, bundled in jackets too thin for the cold and clutching small, worn-out backpacks. Their hair hung in soft, tangled waves, the same shade of warm brown that once brushed against Ethan's cheek when his wife used to lean in close. Their eyes, wide and shimmering with hope and fear, stared up at him with a familiarity that he didn't understand yet couldn't deny. They looked exhausted, like they had traveled far too far for children their age. And yet they stood there bravely, small hands gripping tightly together as though they found courage in each other. Ethan felt his voice drain away, stolen by the shock of seeing such young souls in the middle of nowhere at the doorstep of a man who thought his life had already been written in loneliness. Their lips moved uncertain at first, as if they were afraid the moment might burst like a fragile bubble if they spoke too loud. One of them stepped forward, her tiny boots scraping softly on the wood, and in a voice trembling but determined, she whispered the words that shattered the silence of his world and pulled the ground right out from under him. "Daddy, we found you." Time did not simply stop. It collapsed around him, folding memories, pain, disbelief, and aching longing into one moment so intense he felt faint. For a heartbeat, the air disappeared from his lungs, and the weight of years pressed against his ribs so heavily he thought he might break. His mind raced, searching for logic, for reason, for something that could explain what he was hearing. He stared at them, trying to breathe, trying to understand, but all he could do was stare at those eyes, eyes that looked too familiar, eyes that echoed a love he had buried with his grief. Questions stormed through him like thunder rolling across empty plains. Who were these children? Why did they look like they stepped out of a life he once dreamed of but never received? How could strangers look at him with such aching recognition? And most terrifying of all, why did some part of him feel like he already knew them, as if his heart had recognized them before his mind could catch up? The girls exchanged a glance, drawing strength from each other in the way only twins can, and the second one reached into her backpack with slow, careful fingers. She pulled out a small, faded photograph and held it up to him with the trust of a child who believes deeply in something they cannot yet fully explain. Ethan's shaking hand reached forward, not because he chose to, but because something ancient and instinctual pulled him toward the truth, hidden in that picture. His weathered fingers brushed the edge of the photograph, and as his eyes landed on it, the world blurred around him. It was his wife, his beautiful, lost wife, smiling softly, cradling 2 newborn babies in her arms. The photograph wasn't just proof. It was a doorway into a past he never knew existed. His heart pounded so fiercely that he thought it might burst, and a dizzy wave of realization washed through him. The girls were real. The resemblance wasn't coincidence. The universe had not taken everything from him the day she vanished. It had kept a secret instead. A secret that now stood trembling before him with hope shining in their eyes. His knees weakened, and he sank slowly to the porch steps, unable to stand beneath the weight of fate. He didn't know whether to cry, to speak, to reach out and pull them into his arms, or to run from a truth too miraculous and painful to process all at once. The girls stepped closer, their small hands reaching out uncertain but brave. They seemed afraid he might disappear, just as someone in their lives had already vanished. Ethan swallowed hard, throat raw, voice barely a whisper as he tried to speak, but no words came. He could only look at them, breath trembling, heart breaking open like a dry riverbed suddenly flooded with life. They weren't strangers. They weren't a dream. They were pieces of his heart he never knew existed. pieces he thought destiny had denied him forever. And as the cold wind rustled the ranch grass and twilight deepened around them, Ethan understood that his story had not ended with loss. It had been paused, hidden, held quietly in the world until this precise moment, until two little girls with familiar eyes found their way home and spoke the word he never thought he would hear again in his lifetime. "Daddy?" The girls handed him the faded photograph, and Ethan's trembling fingers closed around it as if it were a fragile link to a world he had lost and never expected to touch again. In that tiny rectangle of worn paper, memories awakened with painful tenderness. His wife, smiling down at two tiny infants wrapped in soft blankets, looked just as he remembered her. Gentle eyes, warm expression, and a strength beneath her softness that had always drawn him to her. As he stared, realization flooded through him, and the truth slammed into his chest so hard it stole his breath. She hadn't died. She hadn't abandoned him out of coldness or choice. She had vanished because she had been forced to protect the children he never knew existed, shielding them from a danger he had never been told about. The weight of those lost years he spent believing he was alone, that his future had crumbled beyond repair, settled into his bones like a long, heavy winter melting into spring. Everything he thought he knew shattered, and everything he never dared to dream suddenly stood real and breathing before him. The twins spoke in soft voices, taking turns explaining in the halting way children do when recounting stories too big for their age. They told him about how their mother always whispered stories about a strong rancher with gentle hands, a man who loved the land and believed in loyalty, a man she had once called her forever. They told him how she made them promise, again and again, that if anything ever happened to her, they would find him, because he would never turn them away. Ethan's heart clenched tighter with every word, each syllable twisting and untying knots of grief and hope inside him. He imagined his wife alone all those years, raising children in secrecy, carrying burdens he never knew, while he stood on this ranch grieving a death that had never truly happened. Pain mixed with awe, and grief blended with gratitude, until his emotions formed a storm too powerful to contain. Tears welled in his eyes, hot and unstoppable, slipping down his weathered cheeks like a river breaking through a dam. He didn't fight them. He didn't try to hide behind pride or silence the way he once did. Instead, he let them fall freely, because these tears weren't simply born of sadness. They were born of relief, shock, love, and a miracle he had never believed could find him again. Slowly, almost without realizing it, he reached out with shaking hands, and the girls stepped closer in unspoken understanding. They leaned into him with innocent trust, and Ethan pulled them into his arms, holding them as tightly as if the universe might try to take them back if he loosened his grip. Their tiny bodies pressed against him, two fragile souls who carried pieces of both his past and his future. For the first time in years, his heart beat not just to survive, but to live. The ranch seemed to breathe along with him, as if the land itself recognized the shift in destiny. The wind that rustled through the wheat fields suddenly felt warmer, carrying not emptiness but promise. The porch that once echoed with loneliness now held life again, tiny breaths mixing with his own, forming a new rhythm that felt like family. Ethan whispered the only words that came to him, voice cracking with emotion. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere."